I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
And those who are most marginalized know the most about the true, the good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm your Anglo-Catholic co-host, Matt Bernico.
And I'm your Roman Catholic co-host, Dean Della.
Oh boy, look, we're just both Catholics on this one now.
Yeah, we are. That's exactly right.
Okay. I'm sure that probably rubs people the wrong way. I don't know. I don't know if it does or not. Well, we'll get to the bottom of it, I guess, in this episode. Today, we're talking with Tony Hunt and Father Caleb Roberts, who are both co-editors of The Hour magazine, which is a really neat Anglican, Episcopalian, Anglo-Catholic magazine. You can find it at thehourmag.com. Man, it is a very cool magazine, and as a newer Episcopalian, I've learned a lot from reading it, for sure, about Christian socialism and all of the very interesting but under-discovered characters of Anglo-Catholic Christian socialism. So if that's something you don't know about but you'd like to, you're really in for it in this episode.
Yeah, I think so. I think one thing too, we talk about this in the episode itself in the interview, but it's worth saying at the top here. I think what I really like about The Hour in particular is there's lots of different Christian lefty kinds of publications that are emerging in the world, and that is really fun to track and to see. But The Hour has this really kind of fascinating niche that is not just theological, but also artistic. Like it's trying to carve out a certain unique vision. And man, all I can say is it's a welcome addition to the wide, expanding, hopefully exponentially expanding world of Christian media in general.
The Christian media cinematic universe that's just mostly magazines on the internet. But it's great. All right, let's get right to the interview then. Today on the show, we have Tony Hunt and Caleb Roberts, who are the editors of The Hour magazine. Whenever we have new folks on the show, we usually just leave it up to them to explain who they are and what their project is. So, Tony, Caleb, go for it. What's The Hour all about, and who are you both? Why are you here?
The Hour is a online magazine, really trying to hone in on the Anglican socialist tradition, but maybe not like a theory rag per se. We got started really to try to bring to bear theory matters on really practical concerns of parish ministry, and that will spill over into actual praxis or whatever. But a lot of it had to do with simply frustration with simplistic ways of approaching issues within the church, if that makes any sense.
I had Tony start out so I could hear him say magazine in that beautiful Minnesota voice that he does. That was mainly the vibe there. I would just add to that, we had that practical focus, and then obviously wanted to kind of an outfit that had a specific kind of editorial angle that we'll probably go into later on. So a targeted editorial direction and a focus on what I would call like the material aspects and conditions of parish ministry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
that's really cool.
Yeah, do you guys want to say a little bit about who you are in respect to the magazine as well?
Sure. I'll take this one. We're both co-editors. That's kind of our titles. As far as personally, I serve as the rector, which is like the head priest, senior pastor, whatever. The rector of Grace Episcopal Church here in Ponca City, Oklahoma. It's a small town just south of the Kansas border here in Oklahoma, which is my home state. I'm from here, and I've bounced around beforehand, but as of last summer, returned to my home state with my wife and 3 children.
Yeah, I'm Tony Hunt. I'm up in Minneapolis. Currently a postulant for the priesthood, which just sort of means a studying stage, if you will. I'm in seminary, being able to direct some of my own studies in unique directions, even though I'm in an MDiv. So that's a lot of fun over at Luther Seminary. And my family and I live in Northeast Minneapolis.
That's great. It's fun to hear about you folks and about the magazine for sure. Matt and I have been reading it here and there for a while now. And I feel like I'm always corralling Matt into talking about Catholic stuff just because that's my world and what I'm all about and reading a lot of. But I'm excited that now we finally have some good Episcopal representation. Matt can check that off of his obligations list. So
I'm going to tell the Home Office.
Yeah, that's right.
I've done this for them.
So maybe you can tell us a little bit more about that. You know, the hour comes out of a sort of broad tradition of Anglo-Catholic Christian socialism. And I think that's also a really fascinating piece of the U.S. socialist tradition. Maybe we can talk more about that later. What is it that draws you both to that tradition of Anglo-Catholic Christian socialism? And what is it? How would you describe that tradition? What's it all about? How does that kind of inform what you guys are up to?
I'll show my age and everything here and say that my initial draw, maybe I don't want to reveal this. My initial draw into the tradition was radical orthodoxy at the time, which when I was reading it said that it was all about Christian socialism. And as someone trying to pull away from the sort of conservative politics of his Pentecostal upbringing really resonated with me. It's just that over time, I came to believe that that was not actually a socialist trajectory in any way, and tried to start diving deeper a bit on my own, kind of in protest against what I had been initially drawn into. With the magazine, I know that we have this impression that we're scholars of history and all that, but that almost happened by accident. In our very first issue, we posted an old essay from the 70s from Kenneth Leach, and we had a loose understanding of the fact that Anglo-Catholic socialism existed, but we really only got that from having read like broad overviews of Anglican history, right? They'd mention it. People talk about something like the slum ritualists or some of these things. But there isn't actually as much detail in these surveys as you might think, and it just so happened that I had an opportunity with a professor at Luther to do an independent study on some of the actual original socialists, and started reading them, looking more deeply into the history, and found myself quite fascinated by how diverse and frankly much more radical tradition it is than one gets the impression of when they hear just modern people talking about it. People talk about Anglican socialism as if really all it means to be is a paternalist Tory interested in English values and social hierarchy, but like being good ones, right? Being generous. But it's a diverse tradition. But even like the guild socialists that some of the modern people will draw on, they want to completely abolish the wage system, hand over all things that you work with to the workers themselves. It was a pretty intense tradition in its own way, in contrast to the way that it's presented in the circles that I initially heard about it.
Yeah. I would second all that from Tony. I would just add for myself, what drew me to it was, I'm kind of an old book nerd, and I started seeking out and collecting kind of old Anglican titles that are out of print. And if you start digging down that hole, you'll find that there are just these Anglo-Catholic socialists that are referenced, whether in the kind of survey books that Tony mentioned or just the names. I actually remember stumbling upon the Kenneth Leach piece that we posted in the most recent issue that I think might come up later. But I found that just like on Google Docs or something back in like 2013, and like, what in the world is this? And it was like this photo scan typewritten thing. So I mean, it was kind of a shiny object for me, at least a little bit. But beyond that, I really resonated with how, particularly in the turn of the 20th century, this tradition of Anglo-Catholic socialism was very particularly rooted in a certain theological persuasion, a liturgical persuasion, and it wasn't just like a generic religiosity that then found a kind of euphemistic expression in politics. Like, they actually had very detailed material analysis for their time, alongside really high level theological sophistication as well. They were kind of firing on both cylinders, at least at their best, and that really appealed to me early on.
That's so cool to hear you guys talk about that. What drew you into doing the magazine, and kind of what put you on the path that you're on now. It strikes me, Dean did mention a minute ago that, we're usually talking about Catholic stuff, and now we're talking about, Anglican stuff. But before we get any further, maybe you could just flesh out some of the terms for us, because I imagine that some of our listeners probably don't know what, Anglican, Anglo-Catholic, Episcopalian all might mean. They might kind of seem like insider language, which I guess they are. So just as like a matter of setting up the rest of the conversation, can you all walk us through what some of those terms mean and how they relate to the hour?
Yeah, Tony?
Yeah, so Anglicanism, broadly speaking, would be a host of churches that are directly related to the Church of England in the shape it became after it formed in the English Reformation, having right around the same time as the Protestant Reformation, right? We had our own Reformation focused on King Henry VIII, and there's a lot of history that we don't really need to go into, but just understand that there are now churches in lots of different parts of the world that have a relationship with the Church of England, and through its worship and history, a relation to each other. And so that's Anglicanism, broadly speaking. Anglo-Catholicism, the term really comes from the early 19th century. There was a group in Oxford that conveniently was called the Oxford Movement. And this little group of people wanted to assert that the Church of England was in fact a Catholic church. It was part of the Church Catholic, and they took some stances against what they saw as extreme Protestantism, and tried to reincorporate practices like private confession and a little bit of higher liturgy as that went on. What's significant for the stuff that the hour is doing is that they had a really adversarial stance against the state. The very first Tract for the Time, the Tract for the Times, are a group of writings that the Oxford Movement published in order to spread their beliefs, right, about Anglo-Catholicism. And the very first one was protesting against the fact that dioceses were being redrawn in Ireland against the wishes of the church. And what they asserted was that the bishops and the church through them had authority completely independent of the state. And although they were very much in favor of the Church of England being the state church, if it were going to break the principles that they thought were key for the church, they were ready to assert the independence of it. And that attitude came to be really significant for the generation of Anglican socialists who came after them. Some of whom, and actually many of whom, were willing to actually make movement for the Church of England to be disestablished. They thought that its connection to power what prevented it from supporting the types of policies that the kingdom of God demanded. And you can see the lingering effects of the Oxford movement in this adversarial stance. However, you don't see as much of the Oxford movement in the socialists as you might think, because the Oxford movement tended to be quite conservative, both theologically and politically, even where they were radical in their charity. In their overall politics, they tended toward the traditional and established. it was really through the influence of F.D. Morris, a theologian, sort of semi-liberal theologian of the same time, and then through liberal Catholicism, sort of started by Bishop Charles Gore and a group of friends. It was through this liberal Catholic tradition that you got an alternative type of Anglo-Catholicism. And so they were running against each other. It's not that all the Anglo-Catholics were socialists. In fact, most of them weren't, and did not like the radical political direction some went. So there's a liberal and a conservative tradition right around the turn of the 20th century. And that's sort of like the golden era of Anglo-Catholic socialism.
It's really cool to hear you spell that out a little bit for me. I think I have some history with the Episcopal Church in particular, which is, its own kind of thing, I guess, in that big story you were just telling, and got married in it and so on. But I think, I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about how you negotiate that tradition. One thing that when I started seeing the hour, I was really intrigued by it on the one hand, and then also kind of, I have to admit, a bit hesitant, I guess, just because I was concerned that maybe it was sort of a Trojan horse for the radical orthodoxy kind of conservative brand of all of that. And I've been really pleased to see that that's not the case. And I'd be curious to just hear you talk a little more, both of you, about negotiating some of the, I don't know, saying the conservative and left-wing elements doesn't seem like the right metric, but maybe you know what I mean, those kinds of things that feed into that tradition.
Yeah. One thing, there's quite a lot that we could say on that. Just to pick an anecdote at random, one of the things that Tony and I have tried to resist doing from day one is, there's this kind of discourse, I'm sure you all have seen it, where particularly in more quote unquote Catholic kind of discourse, you can kind of talk about liturgy or sacraments as like doubles for politics, that just by simply engaging in certain kinds of explicitly religious practices, ergo you are doing something in the world. And it's like, oh well, the sacraments involve bread and wine, and that's material, so now we're and so we in that you can see, not so much in the Oxford people particularly, but in the way that in the discourse that we were observing when we were thinking about this magazine, that was precisely one of the things that we wanted to avoid, the kind of theological replacement of politics, if that makes any sense at all. Tony, does that vibe?
Yeah, and I'm assuming it's one of the reasons that we've often found it difficult to find writers is that it's pretty mainstream to center Anglican like liturgical things as stand-ins for politics. The sacrament is super communist, and so we're doing a communism when we do the Eucharist. And we're not actually trying to say anything bad about doing the sacraments or liturgy or its actual formative effects. All those things can have their own independent truth, but the way that it works in the discourse, I think, and we think, keeps us from doing actual politics in the way that we talk. And we wanted to avoid that. And if there's one thing that gets the Anglo-Catholics a little nervous is if you're like, stop talking about the liturgy. Please stop talking about it.
Yeah. So maybe as far as negotiating it, I think this might continue to come out in our conversation. But we have somewhat of a modest claim. We don't claim that Anglo-Catholic socialism or whatever is its own kind of proprietary socialism that simply by engaging in these kind of thought patterns or studying these figures that necessarily amounts to real world praxis. Rather, we're trying to gain exposure for the fact that our tradition does actually have its own kind of internal radicalism, and back to that kind of practical element of parish ministry, brings some kind of material analysis to what might seem like mundane features of parishes, because they are institutions just like anything else, and they are bound up in place and time, just like everything else is, and yet we don't always consider them that way. If that makes sense in terms of negotiating it.
Yeah, I think it does make sense. Putting it out like that, I think kind of helps, I don't know, answer Dean's question, assuage any fears that might still be there. Maybe to get at it a little bit deeper, though, a question that's, I think, kind of related to this at its core is that the hour has this really particular aesthetic to it that I think is really fascinating. And Caleb, you wrote an essay about it, I guess in the previous issue. I think that's when it was.
Yeah.
Yeah, that the hour takes up this like very interesting modernist aesthetic to parse out a real, yeah, I don't know, I'm just gonna keep saying the word modernism over and over again, but to parse out a real particular modernism that's not just like that's not radical orthodoxy, that's kind of cutting against some of that. So yeah, I don't know, would you mind just talking about a little bit of that that aesthetic in the magazine and how it might relate to the larger conversation?
Yes, of course. Yeah, that was a really fun essay to write. A lot going on in it. So I'm glad that it got some attention. But yeah, I think the background of that essay, Mark Fisher, I'm sure you all are familiar with him. He has that theme, like the cancellation of the future. He'll talk about how like pop culture now is just this constant repetition of nostalgia, which is just kind of this uncomfortable disavowal of the fact that there can be nothing new anymore. So we just like repackage our own experiences. And I was trying to find a way to defend our references to the past, both in terms of like the figures we draw from, and also the aesthetic. I wanted to see if there was a way that I could salvage some kind of radicalism by being rooted in the past, so as to say, while there obviously there's tons of truth to like whether it's Mark Fisher's point or I reference Frederick Jameson in that essay itself. He's talking about parody and pastiche and etc. There's so much that rings true with that critique. I wanted to basically save our own magazine from it, and the essay was basically my attempt at doing that. So in terms of the aesthetic itself, yeah, I mean, there's Tony and I, we're big kind of design geeks on this stuff, and we spend a lot of time sharing like Instagram DMs of old book covers and like Penguin classics from the 60s and Art Nouveau stuff and all this nerdery. That was fantastic. But yeah, a lot of the references come from a similar time that like Vida Dutton Scudder would have been writing, or R.H. Tawney. This is very much in a kind of first half of the 20th century / mid-century kind of thing, which is where Kenneth Leach would have been active as well. And I guess with the essay connected to the aesthetic, I wanted to suggest that we're still in enough of the same world as, again, people like Kenneth Leach or R.H. Tawney or Vida Dutton Scudder. We're still in enough of the same world that not only are their insights still relevant, but the aesthetic, the forward-looking modernism of those references are also still relevant. There's an irony that we talked about, Tony and I talked about a lot at the beginning. Most kind of, at least in the Episcopal Anglican scene, most church publications or outfits, they all have kind of stock photography of Gothic cathedrals. And it's really funny that like no one ever, throws shade on them for being purely nostalgic, and yet you're almost more likely to get that critique if you go with something from like the 50s or 60s. And so I'm rambling here, but yeah, I basically wanted to show with the look of the magazine that it's not just purely retrospective or antiquarian, like a Gothic architecture piece, but it's modernist, and modernist is now. We don't necessarily have to pretend that we're in this purely postmodern kind of pastiche thing. We can still actually recover a real sense of material conditions, a real sense of design, clarity, and movement, etc. If that makes sense.
If I might, Caleb is always delightfully too modest to point out that when we first started constructing the website, I was doing it on my own, and I had right there on the front page in black and white a film photograph I took of some statues at the Notre Dame. Right, so like peak Gothic cathedral. That was the aesthetic that I was going for. I even like tossed up a Latin blog title. And Caleb came up with this image of Vida Scudder with these like pink rays going off of her, and it was absolutely the right choice to go that way. And speaking of Vida Dutton Scudder, and going back to this modernism thing, we have tried all the time not to indulge in some knee-jerk anti-modernism. In point of fact, when I've been rereading Vida's big book, Socialism and Character, and the opening several chapters of it is a historical retelling of the tale of socialism. It's like this is when the socialists came up. This is how it failed. This is the direction we're going, etc. It's a tale of movement. And Caleb and I have always been struck about how with modernism, you get the possibility of action, whereas with a closed off history or maybe an extraordinarily low anthropology, so to speak, what you get is a kind of like anti-action. You're frozen in a particular time or place, and things can't move forward. Things can't actively be transformed and done. And we want to not go that route.
In my essay, I deal with John Berger a lot. I have to plug John Berger. I read him constantly, and everyone should. He's amazing. But he has this great line in an essay on Walter Benjamin, where he says that the antiquarian and the revolutionary both have one major thing in common, which is a rejection of the present as given. And I'm like, that I've always loved that line. Because temperamentally, I have a kind of antiquarian bent just in terms of my personality. But I just love that line, and it really gets at the possibility of the magazine and what we're trying to do.
Yeah, it's so cool to hear you guys talk about that. I think, there is a lot of talk about the aesthetics of kind of the burgeoning socialist movement in the U.S. and elsewhere. And, it's like Jacobin, love it or hate it. It's a magazine that looks very good, no matter what anybody thinks about it. And I appreciate that about the hour, too, that there is this kind of, there's a vision to it that is more than just brute content or something, even though the content is very good. It's like it's trying to kind of invite you into, I don't know, a lot of different things all at once. And I think that's really neat. Yeah, it's something Matt and I appreciate too about like G's magazine, which we spend a lot of time chatting with those folks. There's this kind of artistic vision that is doing something bigger. Well, I want to sort of just maybe steer us in a weird direction to talk a little bit more about Kenneth Leach. You've brought him up a few times, and earlier you mentioned we might get to him. So I think, yes, let's get to him. I know Matt really wants to talk about Angel Nalo-Bega's essay, and we are definitely going to do that. But I think it's important to pull this out since you've been steering us there. So in the most recent issue of the Hour, you're focusing on exploring this character, Kenneth Leach, who's in the Anglo-Catholic tradition and the Marxist tradition. And the Leach essay is really fascinating that you guys have republished and so on. Can you tell us a little bit about Kenneth Leach and what is it that made you want to plan an entire issue around him as a person?
Kenneth Leach was a priest and theologian, but of the unprofessional variety in a way, and also writer on spirituality. who only recently passed away, I believe, in 2015. And he was converted actually to Anglican socialism as a teenager when he heard an anti-apartheid, anti-racist speech given by a member of the Community of the Resurrection from South Africa. And some of the earliest work that Kenneth Leach did, as far as like in the church and activism, was start a group called the Jubilee Group in the 70s, I believe, may have been late 60s, somewhere around there. And he started it actually with Rowan Williams, who almost everyone will certainly have heard of. And they actually went down to South Africa to help organize anti-apartheid work and do radical stuff down there. And in time, Leach wrote about urban ministry, about anti-racism. He wrote in favor of inclusion of LGBTQ people. He addressed things at a time when it was not, I really don't want to say fashionable, because I don't want to diminish the fact that it's come to have more of acceptance. And it's not fashionable, but like before, it was a more mainstream dialogue in certain circles that we might be familiar with. He was writing about those things pretty early on. And through the Jubilee Group, he inspired a great deal of people to continue the mantle, but of Anglo-Catholic socialism, right? But you ask about the essay that we included. That essay, written over 30 years ago, basically says that there isn't anything recognizable as a significant Anglo-Catholicism anymore anyway. What he's trying to do is renew a vision that has been lost a bit. And he became a kind of like a scribe who brings out of the storehouse things old and new, to pull on a biblical passage, and a revival of interest in the OG sources comes in large degree from him.
Yeah, I would say that Leach is one of the few like intermediate bridges between like our present day and kind of the early 20th century to the post-war period. Like I can't think of very many other people besides him that would have been kind of carrying the torch, through the 70s into like the rise of neoliberalism and Thatcher, which he also wrote about very explicitly. He was kind of a lone ranger in that.
Well, it's so cool to hear you guys pull some of these, some of these folks out of the Anglo-Catholic tradition that I hadn't heard of, at least. I'm sure are new to other people as well. Just reclaiming some of the folks that might have otherwise been ignored is such a powerful thing. Especially, Episcopalianism, like the Episcopal Church in the United States, can seem sometimes very apolitical, or at least or on the side of empire sometimes. So to pull out the folks that can speak to the contrary is always very powerful.
Because we don't even know who they are. I mean that's a part of that's one of the side goals of the magazine. Like one of our ongoing rants is that most of these books are out of print. Like you have to be some geek on Abe Books, like me and Tony, like paying $18 for shipping and $3 for the actual book from some UK place. Like we being Anglicans or Episcopalians, we haven't even kept up our own exposure to this. And so it's kind of, it's like digging around in the closet and finding out that there's rad stuff that you didn't know was there.
You mentioned that it often seems like we're on the side of the empire, and that's absolutely the case. And a lot of the people in the circles that we're trying to draw from saw that and were very much against it. I never want to give the impression that the socialists were ever terribly mainstream. It's always been a minority tradition, even within Anglo-Catholicism, let alone within the Church of England. One thing that was a huge surprise to me, actually, going back and reading the sources, is how many of even the relatively conservative side of these groups were violently anti-imperialist. You will get extraordinarily strong protests against what England was doing in the Boer Wars, for instance, and all kinds of calling out of Cecil Rhodes and figures of the time, right? And whole pamphlets against imperialism, because the connection between capitalism and imperialism was being made even earlier, and they accepted it, and that connected with, and I go back to this, connected with their antagonistic stance to the state, meant that they felt free to assert the independence of the church from supporting the political and economic system as it is.
Yeah. That's good.
You know, I'm getting more excited about being Episcopalian the more you all talk. Getting really excited about it. Speaking of some of these, like the countercurrents, the alternative stories that are the rad stuff in the closet that you find. Something that really sticks out to me from the hour, I think it's from the last issue, is one of my favorite episodes. Oh my God. One of my favorite essays that you all published by Angel Nalobega, called Pauli Murray, Anti-Blackness in the Episcopal Church. And I love it for a lot of reasons, but it's like a very cool, if you haven't read it, it's a very cool personal essay that gets at some of these complexities and contradictions that we're bringing up here with like the modern tradition of Episcopalianism or Anglo-Catholicism, whichever word we want to use at the moment. But I want to read this quick excerpt from it that I think is really cool. So Angel writes, "The Episcopal Church has a history that has historically been aligned with power. It's the church of presidents and slave owners, but it's also the church of laborers and immigrants and working class people. It's a place where experiences and identities converge. It's a place where many historically black congregations are closing while white parishes have millions in endowments. It's a place where some people are perfectly content with status quo and where some people are prayerfully fighting for justice in an unjust world." And then she goes on to write, "We cannot have a beloved community if we can't reckon with the reality of the church and the inequities present." And to me, her essay was a really sobering signpost for outlining the multitudes that are contained within the Anglo-Catholic tradition, the good and the bad. So I don't know, kind of going back to that sense of like the modernism that's not necessarily, longing for the past, but with the present. I don't know, like, can you talk a little bit about the inclusion of Angel's essay and maybe the way that like Kenneth Leach and others have led you to thinking through the contradictions within the Anglo-Catholic tradition?
Yeah, Angel wrote that at my behest. I contacted them simply to ask for any piece. I didn't have an explicit topic that I wanted them to cover. She was the one that chose that topic, and I was really excited about it. And it's an excellent essay. And hearing the stories of people has actually been an important part of the hour. And I don't even know that initially we were trying to do that, but there are stories, memoirs in almost every one of the issues that I'm thinking of off the top of my head. And Angel, it would make sense since she's writing for a socialist Catholic magazine, right? Pulled from her experience of first encountering Pauli Murray, and one of the earliest women ordained to the priesthood in the Episcopal Church, and Marx. She picked up a Marx Engels reader and a book by Pauli Murray at a bookstore at the same time. And so they always just sort of belonged together for her. And the story of how that has played out in their experience in the church was fascinating. I'm really excited to have been able to publish it.
Yeah, it's really cool too. We have to have Angel on, I guess, tell us a lot more about the essay in their own words. But I think it's just a cool testament to what the hour is exploring, to hear you talk about how it's evolving and maybe discovering things about it as you go, and being willing to have a vision that's, clear in some ways, clear in terms of what you've been talking about, trying to explore this kind of Anglo-Catholic socialist tradition, but plastic enough also to allow itself to be surprised by that, and especially as editors, being able to open yourselves up to that a little bit. Maybe you talk to us a little bit more about that. I think Matt and I, we started this podcast as a way of maybe contributing something, on the Christian left to the world of media or whatever in our own modest way. But we're really intrigued by other efforts to do that too. I mentioned G's. We really love what's going on at the Bias and so on. And the Hour just seems like one of those, another one of those really lovely little mushrooms, I guess, that's kind of popping up in the rain of whatever socialism that's slowly pouring down over the U.S. and North America generally.
The mushroom in the socialism rain. That's
Yeah.
That's how many That's awesome. Yeah.
I borrowed it from Ernesto Cardenal, so as always, I'm not the poet for sure. But just tell us a little bit more about how that project has developed over time and maybe what you guys have discovered as editors kind of shepherding that project.
Well, one thing, Tony briefly referenced this earlier. We've loved all the stuff that we've published. It has been at times difficult to get the pieces that we are not the piece that we're looking for or the voice that we're looking for. And I think we suspected that as a possibility at the beginning. But that was one thing that I think has surprised / been confirmed in our experience, in that it confirms why we like to exist and why we want to keep going, because we are providing a perspective that's not otherwise available. But we're also, I think we're aware that it's a work in progress to sort of mine this out and figure out what it might look like to be socialists, to be Anglicans, and however those two things relate. Is that fair, Tony?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to underscore how unambitious our origins really were. We were under absolutely no illusions or fantasies that we're going to come in and like do something for the left movement per se. We in fact started it mostly because of the limits that we saw in available venues to write practical stuff for the church. We were dissatisfied with the broad editorial stances that allowed all sorts of things to slip through the cracks, and we just wanted to be able to write and share material that would help the church understand a bit more about how it can minister and understand it in a deeper, more material level. All right, so in the very first issue, we sort of collected a theme around the daily office, and I wrote an essay about highways, essentially, because what I wanted to look at was, if we want to have a daily office, a morning prayer, an evening prayer, or both at a parish, and we think that we should, what is it that makes it difficult for us to do this right now? Because it's not very common. Most ways of approaching that question tend to focus on the perceived limitations of the 1979 Book of Common Prayer, right? What it needs to do is be more in keeping with the 1928 or the 1662 or whatever number, right? Whatever former edition. The problem is something inherent in the liturgy. The liturgy is the problem. If we could just fix that, then people would be pouring in and the daily office would be happening. But I pointed out that if you're going to do a daily office in a church, people need to be able to get to it at a time when that can happen. And in a world where we push both priests and parishioners out into the suburbs, for instance, and have people ship in their cars to go to church, it's going to be really difficult to sustain a devotional practice that way when you need to drive in and then drive off to work. And so I just talked about the way that highways were put in and the limitations that they put on our ability to do corporate worship. And it's not to say that everyone has to instantly move in to walking distance of their parish. That would be great, but that would again be approaching the issue as if it's the individual's fault that we've ordered an entire society and infrastructure around a particular way of being, right? We have literally built highways, infrastructures. We require that people have cars to get around, etc. Throwing the individual into blame for that state of being is just kind of a neoliberal way of approaching the real issue. And what I tried to do was suggest that something deeper is going on. And I didn't have a solution offhand, but I think that before you can even begin to have a reasonable conversation about how to have a daily office in your parish, you need to have a more concrete understanding of the situation that is actually in place.
I think that's such a cool insight. In the most recent issue of the Hour, you have an essay called "Where Spiritual Counsel and Socialism Meet," where you kind of rehash some of what you just said here. But I think something that you say in it that's really profound is just that capitalism makes it really hard to be a Christian person, and it's such a glaringly obvious thing when you really think about it. Like, well, why is it so hard to get to morning prayer or something? Well, it's because the neoliberalization of cities, of cars, of urban sprawl, all of these reasons, right? And it would not appear obvious, I think, to many even that's the problem. You're right. The blame always gets put on the Book of Common Prayer or whatever, but really it's just like capitalism is so far deteriorated our cities that it's even difficult to make it to our church in a reasonable amount of time to pray the office or whatever, or find childcare, or bring your kid with you. Who knows, man? But capitalism makes all these things extremely unlivable. Something that Dean and I have said in the podcast before that I think, works here too, is that socialism makes it more livable, right? Think about how much easier it would be to be a Christian if we had a socialist political economy. It'd be a whole other story. We'd have to think a lot less. We wouldn't think so much about should we actually give money to this person on the street or not, or whatever. It'd be a lot of these questions would be answered for us, and wouldn't that be nice?
Well, I was going to add, not only what you just said, but on Tony, his essay from the first issue, not only was there that macro insight about the way that urban planning has happened, but much more closer to home in terms of I'm a priest already. Tony's kind of on that track. Tony also mentioned, I believe, in that essay that for a long time back in the olden days, Episcopal churches, many of them had rectories, and that's not just those were not just practical things that the priests need a place to live. They presupposed a certain kind of relationship to the devotional lives of the churches, and so yes, the way that urban planning changed over the 20th century with sprawl and stuff, it's obviously a factor, but churches actively sold their rectories. So Tony also mentioned that there were elements where our churches could have actually acted as a bulwark against some of those forces, but instead we made the conscious decision to implicate ourselves in them.
There's a story in the book that I was reading about what to do about moving between cures if you're a priest, moving to a new parish when you run up against an issue in the parish you are currently in. The idea being that if I can just change my external circumstance, then the problem will go away. And there's a lot of literature in the early desert monastics that talk about this, if you can believe it or not. And I share an example of that. What they focus on is stability as the way of facilitating engagement with what is really going on. And I actually agree with that basic insight. But what I was struck by was thinking about how many of my friends and family have had to move regularly, oftentimes every single year of their adulthood, because of the external political and economic forces in their life, right? They've got to go to a new place because their debt is getting over their head, or their landlord raised their rent, or all these sorts of things. They're always moving. And if I were to just come at them as someone training for the priesthood, right, and hopefully one day being a priest and giving spiritual counsel, if I were to just jump into a situation like that, saying, oh, well, you need to have more stability in your life, I'd be missing an entire aspect of what's going on. And in so doing, I wouldn't just be being a jerk. I would be failing to provide the type of care and insight that could actually allow them to go deeper into their spiritual life in whatever circumstance they are currently in. And so that's what had me thinking about it.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear you say that. I guess I mentioned Ernesto Cardenal already, so I'll mention him again. But I was reading, for folks that don't know, he was a revolutionary priest in Nicaragua, and he took a famous trip to Cuba when he was kind of on his revolutionary journey. And in Nicaragua, he lived in this, I don't know, calling it an intentional community is not doing it justice, but he lived in a community of peasants and artists in an island archipelago, you know, where they really tried to practice this kind of utopian socialist model, basically in the shell of very brutal dictatorship. So anyway, he tells a story about being in Cuba, and he has to sit down with a bunch of Marxists, and they're like asking him what he does in Nicaragua. And he starts explaining it, and he's like, yeah, you know, where we live, like there's no mine and yours. It's this kind of place where we live free from that sort of desire. We all live in this kind of union together. And then he sort of pauses in his reflections, and he says it suddenly strikes him that like it's absurd to try to explain that to a person who lives in a society that's moving towards socialism, because like they already get it. And he closes with this quote that I remember from John Chrysostom, where he says, if cities were Christians, monasteries would be unnecessary. And I love that as this kind of picture of, you know, if the society we lived in was truly equitably sharing in the socialist way, then this seemingly radical experiment, you know, in the islands of Nicaragua wouldn't actually be that radical at all. And I don't know if that tracks with what you're at, but it just seems to me like you're asking exactly the right question, or at least the interesting one for Christians on the left, which is like, I don't know, maybe if our societies were different, being a Christian wouldn't be so frustrating all the time or confusing or something.
Yeah. I mean, I think that points to something. I'm still trying to think this out in my head. I'm inconclusive on this, but like, I think it's easy for Christians on the left to, precisely because we're Christians, we can think about socialist aspirations automatically as like utopian or eschatological type desires. And I think it's actually helpful to think about socialist goals much more mundane. Just like there's a baseline. I actually think that a lot of the things that are involved in socialism are just baseline, like natural obligations to human beings, right? Like you don't even have to be a Christian to be under certain obligations to other people as people. We don't necessarily add a whole lot to that as Christians qua Christians. And so I think it's to frame the question of what kind of world would make it easier to be Christian. I think it relocates the question less in terms of like, oh, well, is it the kingdom of God or something like that? All obviously a necessary object of thought, but I don't think it necessarily follows that we have to assume that we have to talk about the kingdom of God every time we talk about socialist aspiration.
Yeah, it's a good note. You don't want to make it so otherworldly. That's great. Well, we're kind of coming to the end of the hour here, and I don't want to keep you all too long, but I do want to ask one more big question for you. And if I don't know, who knows if you can answer it. It might be too big. But anyways, the Anglo-Catholic tradition in the United States, at least, is in some kind of like weird transformation in membership and clergy, and probably also its politics. I don't know, clergy is skewing younger, membership is skewing older, all kinds of like weird things going on. And if I'm to believe my insular Twitter bubble, there's also some kind of resurgence of Christian socialism amongst Anglo-Catholic types. And I mean, you know, the hour is maybe the receipt for that, but you know, there's more than just the hour going on out there too. So I don't know, do you think that that's true about any kind of like returning Christian socialist moment, or you know, if not, it's okay, you can be honest with me and dash my hopes. But I don't know, what do you see on the horizon for these like kind of Christian socialist movements, or people who are, you know, very interested in this kind of thing again?
Oh, well, I definitely think there's a moment. and it's definitely much wider than the hour. In fact, I think that we're, relative to other things going on, pretty insignificant. Small rag that a really niche group of people are somewhat into, right? But so we came to be right around the same time that the bias came to be, right around the same time that G's came to be, right around the same time as Gary Dorian released a gigantic multi-billion page work on the origins of Christian socialism, right when Eugene McCarraher collected decades and decades of work into a 600-page book on socialism. It's there's some kind of moment, something going on in the air, but for me it feels a bit tentative, a bit early to draw conclusions about where it might go, at least in the U.S. That's just my impression, and maybe it's some terrible cynicism on my part. I'm just kind of nervous and reticent, hopeful about where it could go, but too early to call in my mind.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add, this might sound a little bit off the track here, but I don't think it's cynical. Before we could see like an identifiable movement, etc., beyond just certain people or certain outfits like us, we published in our recent issue an essay on clergy age, like the clergy age gap. Like, there are so many contradictions and strange forces that will have to be settled out in the coming years and decades in our church specifically, that are very much bound up in the political alignment of our church. I would definitely say that to emphasize the tentative note that Tony mentioned.
And as far as online, I mean, you're not wrong. It does seem like there's a group, at least on Twitter, right, of people who would consider themselves both Anglican and socialist. I'm not entirely sure yet to what extent that is. There's a connection between the two. You know what I mean? They are both at the same time. But as far as the theoretical connection between socialism and Christianity, that I've been able to see in the sources that I've been trying to draw on and learn from, I don't know if that's fully what's going on. If people are completely on board with an active program of socialism, or if they are just sick to death of being beat up by capitalism and are reaching out for something that they believe can transform that situation. I guess I'm not entirely sure yet.
All right. Well, I'll take the tentativeness of your answers. That sounds good. It's definitely a safe bet. I would probably be more suspicious of you both if you both came out really strongly saying that, yeah, it's here. Cool. Well, at the end of the show here, do you guys want to plug the hour, tell people where to find it?
Yeah, thehourmag.com is our relatively new website that's hopefully a bit more intuitive and user-friendly. You'll find the PDF downloads of our issues, and we also publish the individual essays as just plain text on our website as like blog posts that are just easier for sharing and reading online. That's our website.
Yeah, that's the website. There's a group that's not directly connected with the hour in any way, but there's a new Episcopal caucus in the DSA. If people are looking to get connected to a group that is really just starting and trying to feel things out, but it exists, is a thing that I would point out. But that really has nothing to do with the hour in any active sense. I just wanted to throw that in, maybe to the previous bit about the moment. You know what I mean? Like, is there something going on? It certainly seems like there is.
Yeah, it's a good plug just the same. I appreciate both of them, actually. I think that if you reach out to the religious socialism folks at DSA, they'll point you toward the Episcopal caucus. Cool. Well, it was really great to hear from you both about the hour and kind of get your analysis on all these hot Anglo-Catholic debates and ideas. Yeah, we really appreciate you being on.
Really genuinely appreciate you asking us on. You do a great work. Love your show. It's nice to be asked onto a podcast.
Well, we'll have to do it again in the future.
Sure. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/themagnificast. If you support us there, you get all kinds of cool things like a sticker or access to our Discord channel where we're always talking about, I don't know, whatever stuff. It's great,
Cedric
though.
Robinson
It's great.
lately.
Yeah, Cedric Robinson lately. I don't know. I posted something about Catholic time machines the other day that nobody really talked to me about, which is fair.
I did read it.
I
I read the Wikipedia article on it.
Yeah, man. Isn't the Chronovisor wild?
It is wild.
Okay, you can also get access to things like our behind the paywall Patreon podcast, The Lock-In, which is also fun, where we do more goofy stuff. And we're going to go record it right now, so you'll have to excuse us. Our intro music is by Amaria Armstrong, and our outro music is by The Illogical Spoon. We'll see you next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon. So come on now, it's still early. At least I would have